Hello everyone, this is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast, and in this video we aim to complete our exploration of Asian horror during the 1980s. Let's get right to it. We have a lot of stuff to get through tonight, and remember, all of the videos I discuss will be listed in the description box below. So the first film we're covering is Entrails of a Virgin 3, Rusted Body, also known as Female Inquisitor. 1987 Japanese exploitation thriller horror hybrid. Now in this film, two women satiate their carnal pleasures and torture people in order to extract information so they can steal some money. Now this is not as much fun as its predecessors, unfortunately, mostly because it's more of a formulaic, old-school style pinku flick, which has just too much sex and mediocre filler material to sit through. There's just not enough memorable horror here, in my opinion. There is one pretty good scene where a woman is lowered into a bucket of water with drunken eels that attempt to invade her rear end. So I'll give the film credit for that scene. That scene was quite odd and entertaining, but this third installment simply cannot compete with the mud-caked monster penis from Entrails of a Virgin or the gargling flesh monster from Entrails of a Beautiful Woman. For some reason, when I look at the reviews online, a lot of online reviewers talk this one up a bit, this third installment. So I actually rewatched it a few weeks ago just to make sure, and yeah, I came away with the same impression I decided upon my first viewing. It's just I don't like this one, and it's not like the first two films had a high standard to live up to. This one just doesn't really it doesn't tap my exploitation needs like the other two did enough, you know. So I do not recommend the third one. The next film on our list tonight is called The Haunted Copshop, a 1987 Hong Kong horror comedy. Now in this film, some cops fight off some vampires. Now basically, to be more specific, a Hong Kong police station is used or was used as a place of entertainment by the Japanese during their occupation of that area. Now the problem was that some of the Japanese committed suicide at that location, and one of the dead spirits arises as a vampire to cause problems in the modern day. So, with the exception of an effective fake-out ghost scene early on, and a really hot actress, there's nothing worth watching here. The chases are kind of dull, with none of the interesting strategy or special effects involved in much stronger Hong Kong entries like Mr. Vampire, which was released also in the mid-80s, which I did not include in this Asian horror playlist because, in my opinion, it's more of an action comedy with some horror elements mixed in, but I strongly recommend Mr. Vampire if you have not seen it. Very cool movie. I'll definitely cover that in a separate video review at some point. It's a fun flick. But in terms of Haunted Copshop, you can skip this one. I didn't really like the humor much either. You could skip it. Next here, we're going rapid fire almost today, but we'll slow down with some of these ones that I have more thoughts on. Unfortunately, next we have Evil Cat from 1987, a Hong Kong horror action hybrid. A lot of Hong Kong films during the 80s were hybrid films, which makes it kind of difficult sometimes to figure out which ones to include in this playlist or not. This one seemed to have more horror than action, so I'm including it. And with the title of Evil Cat, one could be forgiven to expect that an actual cat, or perhaps a cat-human monster, would be showcased. But such is not the case here, because the cat spirit, so to speak, is in human form for almost the entire time. Now the horror sequences here are downright awful, and basically consist of some guy or girl tossing the protagonists around while making panther noises. Not good, people. Lots of dull filler to sit through, too. A few scenes with nice lighting and scoring just can't save this one. As a side note, this flick was written by a man named Wong Jing, who is one of the absolute worst directors and scriptwriters in the history of Hong Kong cinema. I absolutely hate this guy. And 90% or more of his movies that he either directs or writes are garbage. And he made a lot of them. So I'm just tossing that opinion out there for you. Evil Cat is no exception. I don't recommend it. Let's move on here. Let's get past these crap bombs here, these turd burglars. Let's get to something good. And this is one that I do think is good. And it's a big moment for us here because we now move on to our first Shinya Tsukamoto film. And as I mentioned in my separate video review of the film Vital, a Japanese romance from 2004, Tsukamoto is probably my favorite director of all time. But the frustrating thing for me is that it is very difficult to recommend his movies to other people because his films are so bizarre and different. A lot of people just don't like his movies. With that said, however, his direction I think is excellent, and there's so much interesting content in most of his films. He's able to execute an in-your-face style without being obnoxious, which is not something I can say about a lot of other more popular directors of weird films. Also, he has a very distinctive style about him, despite the fact that his filmography has a good variety to it. You know, he's made some cyberpunk films, some art house films, some period fairy tale type films, straight up horror films, dramas. He recently made a war movie, which I have yet to see, but I'm dying to. So you can always tell that you're watching a Tsukamoto film, but it still feels organic. Like his style is still expertly infused into the film, and it flows naturally, regardless of what the plot and the characters are, which is really interesting. So those are some of the qualities that I think really make Tsukamoto special. And I've also mentioned this before, but I would highly recommend the Tom Mess book entitled Iron Man, The Cinema of Shinya Tsukamoto. It has tons of great stuff in it. And as you go through, if you're interested in this director, as you watch his films, you could skip to the chapter in the book on each film and read it after you watch the film. Really interesting stuff in there. So what is this first Tsukamoto film that we're talking about? Well, it's called The Great Analog World, also known as The Adventures of Electric Rod Boy. 1987 Japanese cyberpunk fantasy horror film. So Tsukamoto directs this, as I call, zero-budget cyberpunk adventure about a boy with a small telephone pole growing out of his back who travels 25 years into the future and must stop some vampires from unleashing a biomechanical weapon that creates perpetual cloud cover. That's a damn good premise, isn't it? This is a good flick. Now, this boy is assisted by the adult version of his high school sweetheart, just to add a little bit more bizarreness into the mix. So this is very similar to Tetsuo the Iron Man, which we will cover later in this video, in terms of Shinya's rampant utilization of fast-forward effects, supplemented with some stop-motion photography. I'm a big fan of stop motion when it's used well, and it has almost like a very artificial look to it. But in films such as this, I think it really plays, it works really well, given what the themes of the film are and the overall style. Anything that's nightmarish, I like it when he uses stop motion. So the cyberpunk theme of blending flesh and metal is showcased nicely, providing some very cool imagery. This film is only about 45 minutes long, so it flies right by. Viewer be warned, though, that this is very weird and completely nuts. This one's nutty. So obviously this will attract those viewers who enjoy that kind of, I guess you could say, cinematic lunacy. It's pretty oddball stuff. Also, I did feel that it was a little creepy, too. Very, very interesting film. Now, the DVD availability of The Great Analog World is unfortunately difficult to find, but it does occasionally pop up on YouTube, which is where I watched it. Alright. Got a good movie in. It's good. And now we have another first in our next film. This is our first Hisayasu Sato film coming up. So I have to do another director introduction here because this guy is kind of an interesting guy. Now, Sato is basically an exploitation director who has dabbled in some other genres along the way in his career. Now, again, I highly recommend. This is like a Midnight Eye props video because another Midnight Eye contributor, Jasper Sharp, wrote a book entitled Behind the Pink Curtain, The Complete History of Japanese Sex Cinema, which has an entire chapter related to Hisayasu Sato. I haven't read much of the book yet because it's not one that you'd want to read in public, but it was very interesting what I have read, and I read parts of the Sato chapter. So Sato is considered one of the four devils of Japanese film, which represent four directors who basically altered the course of Japanese exploitation cinema. Now, I personally find that a decent chunk of Sato's films can be reasonably classified as horror films, which is not something I can say about a lot of other exploitation films from Japan, which are usually like dramas or comedies or action films or something like that. Now, there are some reasons for this. There are some pronounced uses of violence in his filmography at times, some very pronounced uses. But I find also that many of his films have a creepy, voyeuristic, dark psychological vibe to them that is reminiscent of some of David Cronenberg's earlier works, such as Videodrome. In fact, Sato frequently showcases video camera footage and static screens in the background. Now, unfortunately, the atmosphere of a lot of Sato's films are sometimes overpowered by repetitive sex, but he does have some intriguing contributions to Asian horror that we will cover. And the first film we're going to cover here is a film called Pleasure Kill, also known as Lustmord, 1987 Japanese exploitation horror. Again, this film has a shorter runtime, about 57 minutes, but it does serve as a precursor to this man's infamous film Naked Blood from 1995, which we will certainly cover when we get to that year. The premise here is nearly identical, with a student who secretly administers an experimental serum to subjects who become obsessed with self-mutilation. So this isn't quite as insanely violent as Naked Blood is, but it does have a handful of very nasty, bloody scenes during the second half, some of which include graphic rape, just to warn you. It's a sick little film that's also oddly engaging if you're into that kind of thing. So I do recommend Pleasure Kill. Let's check the availability here. I doubt it's any good. No, difficult to find. Put it on your list, though, if you're into this type of thing. Sato's an interesting director. The next film on this list is another one by Hisayasu Sato, and that is called Lolita Vibrator Torture, 1987, Japanese exploitation horror. Now, is this one as good as the one we just covered? Let's see here. Now, a man kidnaps teenage girls, tortures them with vibrating dildos, and then murders them. Alright? Sato's got me with the premise, but can he come through with the execution? The film does get some positive reviews online. This seems to be one of the ones in his filmography that gets some pretty good reviews. But unfortunately, I just personally found this one rather tedious, even after a second viewing. There are a few references to photography and capturing the moment of death, so to speak, but there's just not much content overall. And you'll see this if you watch a number of Japanese exploitation films, especially like the Pinku style films, which this kind of is. A lot of the Pinku films, I think, just rely so much on depicting long sex scenes that it just gets monotonous and dull. Kind of like a bad torture film can be, right? But on the positive side, okay, Lolita Vibrator Torture does have some scoring and style that is pretty good here. This director's pretty good in the aesthetics area. Even though the film is low budget, he's good with that type of thing. Just the overall visuals and style. So that does give the film a little bit of atmosphere. But the molestation scenes just drag on for far too long, and events are too repetitive despite the fairly short runtime of about 63 minutes. So, unfortunately, I cannot recommend this one to you. The next film on our list here is a film called Magic of the Universe, not to be confused with Masters of the Universe, right? 1987, a Filipino horror fantasy type film. Now here, a circus magician must descend into the depths of the underworld to rescue his daughter from the sinister forces of dark art wizardry. Great premise. Great. Not so great movie. So this is basically like a poor man's version of Ridley Scott's Legend, which, you know, they are very different films, but that's kind of the impression I got while watching this. See, but that film, Legend, had phenomenal visuals to make up for its other deficiencies. This one doesn't. On the positive side, there are a few cool monsters. There's a rabbit with a television growing out of its stomach, which was my personal favorite. Some decent set designs, and some atmosphere. Much of the film was shot at night with moody lighting, and that's always a positive for me. But the two big flaws are the script, which is totally incompetent, and the pacing, which just drags horribly at times. Not a terrible film given some of the positives I mentioned, but in the end, there's not too much to see here, outside of the freaky rabbit, of course. Cannot recommend it wholeheartedly. The next film, however, I did like. See, we hit a few duds earlier in this video. A few of my previous videos here I've been recommending a lot of stuff. We hit some duds here, but we'll get back on track. This next film is called Peacock King from 1988. A Hong Kong fantasy horror action hybrid, I guess you could call it. So in this film, the director is Nagai Choi Lam, who is most well known for his epic feat of B-movie lunacy known as Riki-Oh, the story of Ricky, which I will definitely cover in a separate video at one point. He's also had a few films with horror elements that predate this one, but again, one of those Hong Kong things, I did not classify them as horror films personally, so I didn't really cover them here. However, most of Lam's films are worth watching, so check them out if you get a chance. What about Peacock King? Well, a Tibetan monk played by Yun Bao, who's a very athletic martial arts action star, by the way, journeys to Japan to find Hell's daughter and the key to averting the forebodingly approaching Hell King. So the protagonists here basically go from place to place and fight various monsters, ghosts, and warriors. Pretty cool stuff. The dinosaur exhibit scene is one highlight, as well as one very cool martial arts clash. Now, some of the special effects are dated, but they are fun to watch. Some stop-motion animation is used, which, of course, I'm a fan of. And the Raga demon has a very cool design. Definitely something to watch if you want something in a fantasy setting. Now, DVD availability of the Peacock King is widely available. Make sure you check that one out if you want something a little different in a fantasy setting. The next film here is a film called The Three-Headed Monster, a 1988 Taiwanese fantasy horror action film. So we got two films that are at least somewhat similar back to back here, in terms of genre classification at least. Alright, so let me give you a picture of this film here. It opens with a little kid chasing a ginseng plant that runs and talks. Now, as this is going on, a man-sized 1,000-year-old ginseng king appears. I'm serious, I'm not joking here. But the ginseng dude is actually the good guy here. The bad guy is an ugly-looking Nazi zombie that gets resurrected and terrorizes people. So after that, other bad stuff happens, which forces the kid to go on a journey to save his mother. Alright. Got me with the premise, and this is pretty fun. It's a pretty good flick. A young and very hot Cynthia Khan lends a hand. Now, Cynthia Khan is also starring a bunch of martial arts flicks and action flicks in the late 80s, early 90s. So you got two kind of action stars in this horror film. Well, horror-action hybrid, so I guess that makes sense. It's remember, this is kind of a cheap B-grade fantasy adventure that is good fun, especially if you like lots of low-budget physical effects and unpredictable weirdness and cheesiness. You know, if you've seen my last few videos, you know what all of that means in this era, right? So I recommend it. What about the availability, though? Well, The Three-Headed Monster is available on YouTube with subtitles. So, yeah, there you go. Now, sometimes the audiovisual quality of a lot of these older films isn't that great, but I do recommend you watch it if that doesn't bother you too much. All right, our next one here is kind of an infamous one, but it's another one of those infamous ones that I'm just not a fan of. I'm sorry, but I'm just not. I'm talking about Men Behind the Sun, 1988 Hong Kong exploitation horror film. So this film is a graphic depiction of the war atrocities committed by the Japanese at Unit 731, a secret biological weapons experimentation unit of the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. Now this unit actually existed, and if you read up on it, it's pretty crazy stuff they were doing here. Pretty bad stuff. So this notorious movie really does pull no punches in its attempt to disturb the viewer with graphic imagery. I actually think, based on my research, an actual corpse was used during an autopsy scene. They actually got a corpse of a little boy and showed the autopsy of it in the movie. I'm pretty sure this is true. Correct me if I'm wrong, and some animals were also harmed in the making of this. However, with regards to the actual fake torture stuff, it includes stuff like, tearing the flesh off of a person's arms after exposure to extreme temperatures, and imploding a man who is thrown into a hyperbolic chamber while inflicted with severe pressure. So, these are the type of things where basically the scientists here are trying to see the limits of the human body in terms of receiving punishment and pain. One would expect to be disturbed by all of this, but Men Behind the Sun is such a low-grade, undramatic film that the acts of violence will likely only give the viewer an upset stomach. I mean, it almost gave me an upset stomach. I didn't really find it particularly disturbing on a dramatic level. It didn't really affect me much, other than, sending me to the cupboard to get some Tums, right? Character development is non-existent for the victims, because the filmmakers made the perplexing decision to shoot 75 minutes of boring soldier activity instead. I actually found this film to be quite boring, for a shocker, and I thought the script was just absolutely dire. It just neutered the impact of everything. It's almost like watching a special effects reel outside of the real autopsy scene and the real animal violence. Every other act of violence is just a special effects reel of gore, with like nothing bridging it, emphasizing or kind of accentuating its impact. But, some people like this. A lot of fans of shock cinema like it. I don't recommend it, but it is pretty widely available if you want to watch it. So next, move on to something different, thankfully. And that is Tokyo, The Last Megalopolis, 1988. Japanese fantasy horror drama. And we hit a few fantasy-type movies in this video, a little different from some of the previous stuff here. So set during the early 1900s, a demonic soldier plans to awaken the sleeping spirit of a warrior who was executed 1,000 years ago. Now, if he succeeds, Tokyo would be destroyed. So certain plot details are muddled here and a bit confusing, but this is a very unique film because it blends onmyoji spellcasting, Japanese superstition, and urban development together. So you have kind of like an old school spellcasting type thing set in an almost like sci-fi futuristic urban type blend. Very interesting visuals on display here too, set designs and everything. Very cool special effects, including some stop motion again. Yes, another stop motion aspect. I love it. And some horrific imagery as well, including some bizarre monsters. It is a bit on the deliberately paced side, but when the weird stuff hits, it's very entertaining. And that especially holds true for the finale. So it's a cool live-action film from a director called Akio Jisoji, who, a lot of his films are tough to find, but he's very, I guess you could call him avant-garde, for lack of a better term. This one is pretty cool. It's one of his more entertaining films. Not to be confused, remember, Tokyo the Last Megalopolis, the film I'm recommending, is a live-action film. There's an anime film with a similar title that I haven't seen, but I would like to at some point. But I'm recommending the live-action film. DVD availability. It's available on YouTube with subtitles. Now you have to search the term Tokyo Doomed Megalopolis. I'll include it in the description box below, don't worry. You can find it pretty easy on YouTube. Alright, the next one. The next one's another one that's kind of notorious. Not, well, partially due to its depiction of violence, but just because it's just kind of a well-known Japanese horror film from the 80s. And it's called Evil Dead Trap, 1988, Japanese horror. A group of reporters investigate a possible snuff film at a deserted warehouse, only to encounter a series of Evil Dead traps, of course. Now, first and foremost, the synthesizer score is fantastic and totally memorable. I actually, I think you can listen to a few of the songs on YouTube. Totally awesome. It's like up there with Suspiria's theme, and the theme for Halloween is some of my favorite, I guess, theme synthesizer style or non-lyrical theme songs to horror films of all time. I love it. Now, the camera work here is also effective, and the death scenes are very impressive in their gore factor. Some atmospheric blue lighting is used during night scenes, which works well. The ending is also delightfully absurd. You won't really see it coming, I don't think. Now, on the negative side, there are a host of slasher cliches here, and the weak, confused script apparently exists for the sole purpose of putting characters in vulnerable positions to be slaughtered as necessary. But, you know, this one has more than enough to satisfy, I think. Now, the pacing does drag a little bit, due mostly to its fairly low body count, but this film by Toshihiro Ikeda is still fun to watch, and I occasionally get the urge to rewatch it. Like every year or two, I'm like, man, I got a major urge to watch Evil Dead Trap, so it's in my collection, and I always have fun when I watch it. I like it. Availability for Evil Dead Trap is widely available. It's out there for you. Now, the next film is a film called Tiyanak, 1988 Filipino horror. Now, this is based off of a legendary demon that masks itself as a human baby during the daytime, but morphs into a murderous, blood-sucking imp at night. So the most important part of a killer baby movie for me personally is, of course, the monster design and aggressiveness of the creature. Now, luckily, the little beast here is one ferocious, nasty-looking bugger, and there's no CGI here. It's a physical effect, a prop, and it looks nasty, man. You do not want this thing coming after you. Ultimately, this is kind of a low-budget flick with questionable acting, but the pacing is pretty brisk. Despite a runtime of 2 full hours, it moved pretty briskly, and it's pretty fun to watch. The scoring is good old 80s synth stuff as well, which I'm a big fan of. Pretty good atmosphere as well. So this definitely has enough positives here to warrant a viewing. And as an added bonus, we get a 10-year-old kid with his daddy's revolver and a half-dozen Filipino country boys with shotguns. So things start going down here. Not bad at all. I like this one. So Tiyanak is difficult to find, unfortunately. I know I saw it on YouTube. I'm sure I did. But I couldn't find it recently. There's a newer film called Tiyanax with an S at the end of it. I'll get to my review of that one far later in this series, but I definitely would recommend the one from the 80s, Tiyanak from 1988, over the newer one. Alright, so our next film is a big one. It's another big one, and it's from our good friend Shinya Tsukamoto. A lot of people hate this film. A lot of people hate it. And I can understand why, because it's so abrasive and strange. But I love it, and I think it's highly entertaining, and it gets better every time I watch it. And I'm talking, of course, about Tetsuo the Iron Man, 1989, Japanese cyberpunk horror. If a nightmare were ever recorded on video, this would be it. It's an outrageously weird, outlandish film about a man whose body cultivates metallic devices, so wires and metal continue to rip through his skin and overtake him. And if that weren't bad enough for this guy, a psycho metal fetishist invades his dreams and is out for revenge. So this was shot in black and white, and it lasts only 67 minutes. This one moves very briskly and relentlessly, pummels the viewer with an assault on the senses. I mean, it's only 67 minutes long, but every time I rewatch this movie, I feel like just beaten up, like somebody threw me into a bag and just beat me with sticks for 67 minutes, and I love every minute of it. Now, most interestingly, some stop-motion animation is used, and fast-forward photography are used as well throughout, creating a truly unique cinematic experience amidst the backdrop of mankind's relation to technology and urbanization. There is some pretty wild violence and sex in this, but I think it's quite bearable considering the non-use of color. You know, it's all black and white. And this is one of those instances where I think that the black and white use really supplements the themes of the film. I mean, you're talking about metal and urbanization, you know what I mean? That type of thing. And, you know, the colors associated with that kind of are consistent with a black and white scheme in the film. So I really like the use of it in this. I found some of the imagery here to be quite terrifying as well. It's definitely nightmarish. I mean, anyone looking for a completely novel experience would do well to see this one. It's quite possibly the craziest film I have ever seen. We've covered some crazy ones. You know, I always say like The Boxer's Omen and House are like in my top 5 craziest movies of all time. Well, Tetsuo is probably number 1 for me. It probably is. So what's the availability here? Well, it's widely available on DVD. It is, so I would check it out if I were you. I can understand if you wouldn't like it, though. It's freaking awesome. So next, we have a film called Impactita, 1989 Filipino horror. A seemingly normal teenage girl turns out to be the daughter of an aswang monster, meaning that the same blood runs through her veins. Now, this film begins quite strongly with a series of attack sequences and a good dramatic setup. The script takes itself seriously and stays focused on the plights of the protagonist, who is well acted by the lovely Jean Garcia. Now, there are a few disturbing moments along the way, due mostly to the fact that the town is filled with degenerates and violent criminals, so it's more of a dramatically based film, I would say. The special effects are practical and good enough, even though they are a bit rubbery looking at times. However, there are some cool transformation sequences here too to enjoy. I saw this one without subtitles, but I enjoyed it very much. This is a good flick. DVD availability of Impactita, well, I watched it on the Filipino channel online, which is called TFC.TV. A lot of their films do not have subtitles, but what I did, I think, was that I got like a 1-month membership for TFC.TV.com, or TFC.TV, I should say, and then I watched a bunch of the Filipino horror films on that website over the course of a month. So you may want to do that if you're interested in this country's output. So that's Impactita for you. And now we have another first in this video. And we finish this video with our first Kiyoshi Kurosawa film. Oh man, it's another all-time favorite director for me. Definitely one of the greatest horror directors of all time. I mean, I find his horror films to be infinitely watchable because, like Shin Tsukamoto, he has a very distinct style that's difficult to replicate. I don't see a lot of other directors replicating this type of style of film. And even if they do have a similar overall style, Kiyoshi has a very, very nuanced, I guess, way of filming films. You know what I mean? And when you see his films, you get an idea of that. Now, this film Sweet Home from 1989, a Japanese horror film, of course, is fairly unorthodox when compared to his subsequent horror films. Now, a fun fact here before I get to the plot. This film, Sweet Home, was released in conjunction with a video game of the same name during the late 80s. Now, this game, Sweet Home, is considered to be the original survival horror video game, at least in Japan, and served as inspiration for the Resident Evil video game series. Pretty interesting fact there. I'm a huge fan of the Resident Evil video games. Movies, not so much. So, Sweet Home. Back to Sweet Home here. In this film, a news crew goes to an abandoned house to find and film a rare painting, but cross paths with a deadly apparition instead. So this is I would have to say the first half hour of this film is pretty good. It doesn't start with a bang. You gotta wait a little bit for it to build up here. But, about half hour into the film is a really cool horror sequence with expert use of shadows and gore in the same scene. It's very cool. You have like some gore, and then you have almost like a gothic style shadow sequence. Very cool stuff. Overall, the supernatural phenomena that are showcased after that scene are quite impressive and diverse, with both the practical and special effects being quite cool, and they work quite well here. There's also an underlying theme of maternal love. That works. Now, this is not nearly as cerebral or psychological as Kiyoshi's later titles, but it is certainly entertaining and worth seeking out. DVD availability of Sweet Home is that it is available on YouTube, but without subtitles. Alright, so that does it for Asian horror from the 1980s. A decade that I think we can all agree was super saturated with all kinds of cult flicks. But there were also some impressive quality films as well, right? Because, an entertaining movie, in my opinion, it really is quality, because that's what it's supposed to do. So a lot of these cult flicks that I don't consider to be quality films in terms of traditional filmmaking still means that they're, they can hold their own in the entertainment value of filmmaking. A lot of them certainly can. Now, if I had to choose a few personal favorites from the decade, I'd have to go with The Boxer Zone, Tetsuo the Iron Man, Mermaid Legend, and Village of Doom. Those would be my top 4. So, be sure to join me in my next video in this Asian Horror Year in Review playlist when we dig into the 1990s. A lot of good stuff in that decade for sure. And as always, we'll see you next time.